together, and then like a little wristband. So if you want to grab that, feel free to do so before I start or at the end.
Golden code. What I just turned it off. I'm doing it.
Because you told me you fell on the floor. I went down to see you on the security camera fall, and it was all lies and deceit. Now I'm going to make sure I put water on the floor so you can trip.
Make sure your phones are on silent. Don't forget that part. And I think we're going to go ahead and get started.
So Mr. Link, if you would go ahead and switch over to the other PowerPoint for me, please.
It's a disease that affects the way someone would move.
No.
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 It's when the neurons don't fire properly to prevent messages from going to the body.
Illness that attacks the viability of a motor neuron.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
No.
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 Yes.
I have.
Yeah. No.
No. Yes.
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 Yep.
Shop.
I did a project on myself.
My stepmother was diagnosed with ALS 3.5 years ago, fought a gallant and brave battle against a dreaded disease, and unfortunately succumbed to the illness in March of last year.
During the summertime when everybody was doing the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge.
On the ALS challenge.
From the Ice Bucket Challenge and just news.
Media, social websites, word of mouth, friends, family, just community, research.
I've heard it on the news. I know people who've had it. I've heard about awareness for it.
Yeah.
No, it's too cold. I heard it. Yeah. No.
Yeah.
Yes, I have.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Muscle atrophy.
Fatigue. And things like that. I figured they would, their muscles wouldn't work too good. Chills, that's why they did the Ice Bucket Challenge. They were throwing chills and tingling and stuff. But I don't know.
Struggling with doing everyday tasks.
It causes people to not be able to perform basic functions such as walking and talking.
I know they have some sort of, I think they have some sort of memory problems, or like mental problems.
Lack of something. Wait, isn't it?
There's not a 100% found cause for ALS yet, but there are some ideas that it may be blows to the head, pollutants in the environment such as heavy metals, and also some pesticides are under research at this time.
Deterioration of the myelin sheaths.
I didn't think that there was a cause.
No, I do not.
No.
No. Possible.
There is a correlation between the military and ALS. It seems that individuals who are veterans are diagnosed with ALS at a much higher rate than the normal or civilian population.
Due to the stress of warfare and the machines and artillery that they use, it can cause ALS.
Family friends was in the military, and they are being very supportive from the VA with that family because they feel as if there is a link.
No.
Good morning. My name is Thomas Gilmore. My Master's of Technology diploma is on amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS. Its causes, progression, treatments, and the prevalence in military veterans. So today I will be covering my thesis, a background and brief overview of ALS, general information about the disease, its progression and treatments, ALS in the military, my product, method, results, and I will conclude with my discussion. My thesis states that determining decisive contributing factors to ALS development, especially those of an environmental nature, is an important step in understanding reasons for a higher incidence of the fatal affliction in military veterans as compared to non-military individuals, and ultimately a vital step in finding a cure. So first I will cover a background and brief overview of the disease, which will entail its naming, increasing awareness, and a disease overview. ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, has 3 words in it, and it all takes its name from Greek roots. Amyotrophic is defined as without nourishment to muscles. In patients with ALS, this refers to the lack of nerve function or motor function that occurs as neurodegeneration manifests itself in patients. Lateral refers to the side, and in patients with ALS, lateral means that in the spinal cord, it affects the lateral or outside portions of the spinal cord, and sclerosis means hardened. In patients with advanced ALS, the state of their spinal cord is in fact hardened. Originally, when the disease was discovered by Jean-Martin Charcot in 1869, not many people knew anything about it because it had just been discovered. And it wasn't until Lou Gehrig, a famous New York Yankees baseball player, developed the disease that people in popular culture started having a greater understanding of the disease. And even since then, popular knowledge of the disease has only grown. In 1950s, the Muscular Dystrophy Association, commonly known as the MDA, was first founded by various neurobiologists and neuroscientists in hope of finding various cures for effects are in voluntary musculature and involuntary musculature. Cardiac muscles aren't really impacted all that much, but the voluntary musculature first experiences atrophy or shrinking of the muscles as ALS progresses. And the muscular system is responsible for a number of functions such as movement. The spinal cord, which is shown in the picture below, experiences many detrimental effects from ALS. As shown on the left, there's a healthy and unatrophied spinal cord, and this would be a patient without ALS. However, on the right side, you can tell from the atrophy or shrinking of the spinal cord along the lateral sides, giving it the name amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, that ALS certainly impacts the spinal cord. In addition, there's a bit of discoloration, which may hint towards the sclerosis or hardening of the spinal cord. And while the spinal cord and central nervous system are affected, the muscular system is also affected. The patient shown below is taken in photographs after limited progression of the disease. So on the left, for example, the disease is less progressed than it is in the right picture, and you can tell from the atrophy or shrinking of the muscles, specifically those in the upper arm, like the biceps and triceps, and the muscles in the legs, such as the quadriceps and calf muscles. So from left to right, it's not necessarily completely noticeable just because the patient has only experienced limited progression, but you can tell there is definitely a bit of shrinking or atrophy in the muscles. So while the muscular system and central nervous system are affected in cases of ALS, doctors and researchers aren't really sure what causes ALS in 9 out of 10 cases. In other words, in 9 out of 10 cases, there is no apparent causation. And this includes genetic history and evidence in lifestyle or environment. So in 9 out of 10 cases, scientists can't necessarily say that because your mother had ALS or because your father had ALS or because you have a gene defect that it has caused ALS. Which this has given rise to the terms sporadic and familial ALS. Familial ALS can be attributed to various gene dysfunctions. And then sporadic ALS, in other words, scientists and doctors aren't really sure what causes the disease in certain individuals. So it could be some random unknown factor, like a genetic factor or an environmental factor. While there is much uncertainty surrounding ALS and its causation, TDP43 is definitely certainty. TDP43 is a gene that produces an RNA regulating protein. In other words, this protein helps with protein encoding and instructions throughout the cell to help make more energy in cells throughout the body. Philip Wong's research at the Johns Hopkins University has shown that in 97% of cases of ALS, there are various dysfunctions in TDP43. And from these dysfunctions, there become an accumulation of clumps or cryptic exons. And cryptic exons are bits of genetic information here and there that are not used in protein production. So the loss of TDP43 or various dysfunctions leads to the expression or excess of those little bits of cryptic exons. And in this case, the cell interprets this as a dysfunction within itself, and so it sends a message to go destroy the messenger RNA, which are used in the protein production. And so when the messenger RNA are destroyed, protein is not produced at a high level. So with protein reduction, cells cannot function and they die. And so this is necrobiosis. And some people refer to it as apoptosis, and that's what I like to think of it as. Apoptosis is basically programmed cellular suicide. So this can be seen in patients with autoimmune deficiencies, such as AIDS. And what this means is that the cells send little messages to go destroy themselves so no further damage occurs. So it's a dysfunction. And while 9 in 10 cases cannot be attributed to specific causation, 1 in 10 can be specifically attributed to genetic causation. And of this 10%, 4 to 6% can be determined from 2 specific causes. 1 to 2% of cases can be attributed to dysfunctions in copper zinc superoxide dismutase, or SOD1. SOD1, scientists aren't necessarily sure how it relates to ALS development, but they do know that it converts reactive oxygen to water. So scientists are determining what role this plays in protein production and ALS. 3 to 4% of cases can be attributed to dysfunctions in chromosome 9 open reading frame 72, also known as C9orf72. And once again, scientists aren't really sure its function yet, but they do know it is produced in the fluid surrounding the brain and in the neurons. So they're studying its location in terms of how that may impact patients to develop ALS. And environmental causation has been an often studied subject of ALS development. And exercise has been one such subject within environmental causation that has been closely scrutinized. People were looking at various NFL players, such as Steve Gleason, and Italian soccer league players, and noticing a higher rate of ALS among these certain individuals. However, upon further research, scientists have determined that exercise does not cause ALS, and it actually may decrease your likelihood of developing the disease. And an important thing to note here is correlation does not imply causation. This is a phrase used, and it means that even though certain populations, such as those NFL players or those soccer league players, have a higher rate of ALS, you cannot specifically attribute the cases of Lou Gehrig's disease to the specific sport or exercise in general. However, contact sports are proven to increase one's chance of developing ALS, specifically because multiple impacts to the head or 2 or more severe cephalic injuries or concussions predispose people to developing the disease, and scientists are once again determining why this may increase one's likelihood of developing the disease, but are not necessarily sure at this point. In addition to exercise and head injuries, scientists have also determined and proved incorrect the influence of various toxins, specifically environmental toxins, like heavy metals, such as uranium, radiation and electromagnetic fields, viral infections like polio. And all of these scientists have determined at this point that there's no link between any of these aforementioned toxins and ALS development. However, more research continues to be conducted in hopes of finding a link between something such as uranium and ALS development. An important thing to note with these studies are the issues in data collection methodology. In other words, scientists and researchers have to distribute surveys to general populations and populations of ALS patients in hopes of finding a cause, because it is not necessarily humane to place an individual in an environment that may be toxic or radioactive or electromagnetic, because it could have various adverse effects. So they rely upon these surveys, which patients and people in general tend to have a recall bias. In other words, they might attribute a specific case of ALS to perhaps working in a nuclear power plant. One toxin, if you would like to call it a toxin, that has significantly shown to increase one's chances of developing ALS is warfare. But warfare is not necessarily a toxin. However, warfare may expose people to toxins, and this will be discussed later on. So regardless of what may or may not cause ALS, patients all experience various initial symptoms, such as myasthenia, or weakening in the muscles, specifically distally, or such as like out in your hands or feet. And this leads to troubles with various activities of daily living, or ADLs. For example, if I have ALS, I might have trouble buttoning my coat or putting up clothes on a hanger and hanging them in my closet. And so this begins to lead people to believe that they may have ALS. In addition, fasciculations, or tiny little ripplings beneath the skin of the muscles, dysarthria, or trouble speaking, fatigue, and pseudobulbar effect, or PBA, or uncontrollable bouts of laughter or crying, are all initial symptoms of the disease. So how does ALS progress, and what are its treatments? Well, that determines evaluating its diagnosis, symptom progression, the general path of conditional degeneration, and treatment. Since ALS resembles various neurodegenerative ailments, or ailments that impact the way messages are sent throughout the body because of deterioration of neurons, scientists have to use a number of tests to rule out these other ailments such as multiple sclerosis, or MS, or spinal muscular atrophy, or SMA, to come up with a differential diagnosis. So tests such as electromyograms, or EMGs, magnetic resonance imagery, or MRIs, and blood tests are all used in ruling out those diseases like MS or SMA. And once again, ALS cannot be diagnosed by an individual test. So after patients undergo a variety of tests and all other neurodegenerative ailments and ailments that resemble ALS are ruled out, scientists can finally come to a diagnosis, or doctors can finally come to a diagnosis. So regardless of the diagnosis, symptoms all progress along the similar timeline. So as muscles atrophy or shrink and weaken, systemic muscular atrophy and neurodegeneration is commonplace in patients. In other words, muscles throughout the body all shrink and your motor function throughout the body all loses its ability. So an exception in this case of systemic muscular atrophy and neurodegeneration is in cases of monomelic amyotrophy. And in cases of monomelic amyotrophy, patients actually experience a loss of function in perhaps one limb or one side of the body for an extended period of time, and the symptoms don't become systemic or widespread throughout the body. But as systemic musculature atrophy takes hold in patients, they have an increased difficulty in many activities, such as those activities of daily living or moving. And they experience dysphagia and dysarthria, or trouble swallowing and speaking. And an important thing to note with this trouble in swallowing or speaking is the bulbar onset form of ALS. And in the bulbar onset form, dysphagia and dysarthria are some of the first symptoms. So patients may not actually experience the muscle weakening or shrinking until later on, but the loss of speaking and swallowing ability points scientists to believe that they have a shorter lifeline. For example, patients may live 5 years if they begin their symptoms with atrophy, or they may live 2 or 3 years if they begin their symptoms with dysphagia and dysarthria. And spasticity and rigidity and hyperreflexia, such as exaggerations of the gag reflex, are all part of the symptom progression. And as the symptoms progress, patients all face a general path of conditional degeneration. In other words, the symptoms occur along the same timeline. So for example, if a patient may live 10 years with the disease, or a patient may live 5 years, a patient who lives 10 years may not have speaking issues until 6 years into the disease, or trouble swallowing until 6 years in. But a patient who lives 5 years may experience these difficulties in 3 years. And so, as this trouble swallowing takes foothold in the patients, they risk the aspiration of food, meaning breathing it in. So, in this case, the aspiration of food leads to increased risk of choking and pneumonia. And like I said, the timeline of respiratory troubles, among other symptoms, all take foothold along the same timeline. And patients all experience an impact on voluntary musculature, or the muscles we can control just based upon thinking about it. So for example, bending your arm, that's using voluntary musculature. And as this voluntary musculature weakens and symptoms become systemic or widespread throughout the body, the axial musculature is the last to go. Axial meaning center of the body, such as the muscles in the chest or stomach. And as these axial musculature weaken and atrophy, patients begin to experience a loss of speaking ability, and eventually this leads to respiratory failure or the inability to breathe, which causes death in the majority of patients. And in most patients, cognitive abilities have demonstrated not to be impacted. However, scientists are beginning to link various forms of dementia with ALS. And in treating the disease, a multidisciplinary approach is used. So what is a multidisciplinary approach? Well, it's a wide array of treatment options and healthcare providers and specialists that are all used in combating the disease. In other words, pharmaceutical and physical treatments may be coupled with various specialists like therapists, occupational therapists, physical therapists, physicians, speech pathologists, and other providers to all come together and combat the disease in a unified way and hopefully slow it down as much as possible. So for pharmaceutical treatments, there is no cure for ALS, which points back towards the invariably fatal portion of the disease, meaning that all patients will die with it. However, riluzole or Rilotec, which is the only FDA or Food and Drug Administration approved drug, does slow the symptom progression and the need for ventilatory or breathing support. So patients may not need it until 5 years and 8 months with the medicine as compared to just 5 years without the medicine. And the medicine was approved in 1995 by the FDA. So there have been no new pharmaceuticals that have been FDA approved to combat ALS. And a little bit of a drawback with riluzole or Rilotec is that it is extremely expensive for the benefits it provides. So patients on the prescription or drug may only live for about 6 to 8 months more than those without the drug. And for a medication that costs between $1,000 and $2,000, as the patient was cited saying without Medicare, the drug may not provide a good benefit for patients. And as riluzole or Rilotec is the only FDA-approved drug, various drugs are undergoing drug testing and FDA approval in hopes of combating ALS. The need for FDA approval has grown as patients express their frustrations with the disease and lack of treatment. And on the other side, there are drugs undergoing research and development. And in fact, a new research and development screening process has been developed by researcher Justin Achita in the Department of Defense, or DoD. And this screening process takes already released pharmaceuticals and runs them through, in layman's terms, a little machine to determine the composition of these pharmaceuticals and determine whether or not the contents may be beneficial in treating ALS in hopes of creating a conglomeration of various portions of pharmaceutical drugs to combat ALS. And one such drug is GM6. GM6 in clinical trials has shown to significantly slow ALS, and in one patient in a single patient study, it actually improved his motor function, which points to the need for accelerated approval. In patients with terminal diseases or diseases that will cause them to die, the FDA sometimes uses this thing called accelerated approval. In other words, if the patients are terminal and the drug may not impact their health in a negative way, even if it may not impact it in a beneficial way, they might approve these drugs to be used in patients. And while there are currently no medications to treat ALS other than riluzole, there are medications to decrease symptom severity, such as baclofen and diazepam, which decrease spasticity, gabapentin, which helps with pain control, and trihexyphenidyl and amitriptyline, which help with swallowing. In addition to various pharmaceuticals, physical treatments are used to help prolong and improve the quality of life. One such physical treatment is a percutaneous endoscopy gastrostomy tube, or a PEG tube, commonly known as a feeding tube. So when patients have the inability to swallow after a while, their physicians or other health providers may suggest that they use a PEG tube to help with nutrition so they can live for longer. In addition, nocturnal ventilatory assistive devices, such as the Nurex as shown in the bottom left picture, may protract and improve the quality of life. But what is a nocturnal ventilatory assistive device? Well, simply put, it is a device that helps patients breathe once they start to encounter the first symptoms and signs of respiratory failure or troubles breathing. ALS in the military has been perhaps one of the most important things in ALS development and the new knowledge of the disease in the past few years. And a few important things to note in ALS in the military is veterans' increased susceptibility and the increased prevalence of the disease within veteran populations, risk factors, and government acceptance and aid. Veterans are 1.5 times more likely to develop ALS than non-serving individuals or civilian individuals. And this is seen in World War II, Korean, and Vietnam War veterans. And there's an even greater susceptibility in Gulf War veterans. Veterans of the Gulf War are shown to develop the disease at a rate 2 times as high as that as non-serving individuals. But why is that? Well, frequent exercise has already been debunked, and so patients with the disease who may be veterans, even though they have increased rates of exercise or may exercise 5 times a day, the exercise does not link to the ALS. Head injuries, which veterans may be more prone to experiencing while serving, is a risk. And though no specific environmental toxins have been attributed to ALS development other than those head injuries, there's been a large scrutinization of the Gulf War. And in the Gulf War, various nerve gases and enzymes were used. And so this points researchers to look at Gulf War syndromes, in which patients from the Gulf War would come back home complaining of various undisclosed neurological diseases or troubles, such as numbness in the hands and feet, or tingling, or nerve pain with no apparent causation. So scientists continue to determine whether or not the Gulf War syndrome is linked to ALS development, but they believe it is. As I said before, there's a lack of pinpointing evidence in ALS development. However, scientists continue to examine the increased exposure to toxicities that military individuals may face. And another thing that's important to note, as I mentioned before, is the link between correlation and causation. Whether or not the fact that just because they're in the military may or may not predispose them to ALS because of certain toxicities that toxins that they're exposed to. So, also as I said before, there's a recall bias. So veterans may realize that, oh, I was overseas or I was in the Gulf War and my exposure to nerve gas A caused my ALS. So they might remember that as a contributing factor. And there is the ethical dilemma in testing. And as researchers are not able to attribute a specific cause of ALS from environmental factors, they are now researching the use of depleted uranium ammunition, as depicted in the diagram in the lower left. And this ammunition was used for anti-armor ammunition. And scientists, like I said, are determining whether or not the depleted uranium ammunition can be linked to higher rates of ALS. So since 2008, or actually before 2008, the government did not necessarily accept ALS as service-related, but since 2008, they have come to a greater grips with the disease as being service-related. And this can be seen in the 2008 Veterans Administration policy change regarding disability compensation. And in this policy change, patients who served for 90 days or more active service with ALS were given full military compensation for disabilities because there was a link between ALS development and the military. And as part of this increased acceptance, the government is also aiding various research opportunities in hopes of finding a cure or better treatments for the disease. And this can also be attributed to public efforts such as Veterans with ALS lobbying in Capitol Hill. And as acceptance has increased, so has government aid. There's been a steady increase of government funding in the last decade or two. And from 2004 to 2014, the government contributed $850 million to ALS patients and treatment and related research. And in 2012, the Department of Defense, which has been a strong contributor of ALS funding, contributed $6.4 million to the disease's research and treatment, and that has increased. In 2013, 2014, and 2015, they have contributed $7.5 million each year. Included in the $7.5 million is a 2014 Pentagon grant in the sum of $2.5 million, which was given to the Cedars-Sinai Regenerative Medical Institute to test the theory that with a genetic flaw, the military demands trigger ALS in certain individuals. So for my product, I've put together, or begun to put together, a 5K, and my binder is on the table should anybody like to take a look at it. And included in this binder is information about the 4 Hour Heroes 5K, a 5K run-walk to benefit amyotrophic lateral sclerosis patients and related research, which will be held on Saturday, March 19th at 9 a.m. And all proceeds from the 5K will benefit the ALS Association Greater Philadelphia chapter. And in my product, I include things such as a timeline of how I've begun to set up the event and a projected timeline as to what I will do up until March and even after I hold the event. And included in this are my various contacts with people such as Mrs. Julie McKeever from the ALS Association, and writing my Master's in Technology diploma paper, and completing my initial paperwork, and sponsors, and contacting various individuals such as Mr. Ray Parker from Tri-Sports Event Management, a 5K organizing company, to all help me set up or begin to set up the 5K. And this is more my projected timeline. Yes, it is December, but I'm still projecting into December because the month is not over. And so from December onward, I'm planning on releasing my sponsor letter and sending it out to various businesses throughout the community, and making final decisions and advertising and holding the event, and completing post-event paperwork after the event is done, such as accounting information and a press release. And my advertisements have been one strong core focus of promoting the event. And as you can tell from the picture on the right, this is one of the flyers that will be released as an advertisement. And if you can see the banner all the way on your right side, that is a banner promoting my event. So for my methods, I had various first-hand experience with the disease of ALS, and I contacted the Philadelphia chapter of the ALS Association, and they pointed me to various research on their website and other websites. In addition, I also looked through books, periodicals, health journals, and websites, among other references, and used all this information to help complete my paper, product, and my presentation. My results, I found my thesis was proven to be true. In fact, determining decisive contributing factors of ALS development, especially those in environmental nature, is a crucial step in understanding reasons for a higher incidence of the affliction in military individuals as compared to non-military individuals, and a vital step in finding a cure is actually true. And this can be seen in the fact that we don't really know what causes ALS in 9 out of 10 cases. And there is a higher military prevalence of the disease. And this will all hopefully lead us to finding a cure for the disease. Like I said, I've had personal experience with the disease. My grandmother passed away from complications related to ALS back in March. So this led me to complete my senior research paper and my product, as well as my presentation on ALS, and she was a military veteran. And so, like I said, I have a personal connection to my product. I want to raise money for the ALS Association in hopes of finding a cure. And there is a need for better treatment and a cure for the disease, which we will hopefully find. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? Carissa?
What complications do patients have that directly lead to their death?
You said what complications do patients have that lead to their death? Respiratory issues, specifically respiratory failure, all, for the most part, lead to patients' death. And for example, in my grandmother, she passed away from respiratory complications related to ALS. And aside from the respiratory complications, patients might not be able to receive the proper nutrition because they can't eat, but for the most part, the respiratory complications cause it. Mr. Siri?
Does going through therapy help ALS?
Did you say, does going through therapy help ALS? Yes, it does. Physical therapy and occupational therapy, as well as speech therapy, all slow the progression of the disease. So patients that may experience a loss of speaking ability, from the therapies like speech therapy, may be able to speak or find a way to communicate more effectively as they lose their speaking ability. And in terms of the physical therapy side, physical therapy is used to help combat contractures, such as like when the muscles tense up and are unable to, when the muscles contract and just stay that way. So that's used to combat the symptoms. Mr. Checkett?
You said you had experience with ALS, so what kind of recommendations do you have for a family that has an ALS struggling in the family?
You said what recommendations would I have for someone with a family member with ALS?
Yes.
I would say just that to appreciate every moment that they're still around, even though they might experience, well, they will experience, a decrease in function as they become unable to do tasks such as move or speak and eventually breathe. I think that accepting their eventual decline and just appreciating every moment with them is kind of key. And I think the most important thing to remember is that even though they may lose their physical function or they're losing their physical function, that for the most part, most patients are still cognitively, quote unquote, with it. So a patient might be very bright and unable to communicate those bright thoughts with people because of the loss of speech function. Any other questions? Thank you.